Welcome back to Thursday Thoughts. This is our fourth episode, and we will be discussing police brutality and systemic racism. To join me in our discussion is Camden Johnson, the chairman of the Young Democrats of South Carolina Progressive Caucus. So, Camden, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Ryan. I don't think that I have to tell anybody that police brutality and systemic racism are at the forefront of the American struggle right now. I think that George Floyd, I'm not sure what exactly, but something about this one just kind of hit everybody differently. And now, with all these protests and everything that have sparked, we're really at a crossroads to where people aren't going to be satisfied until some sort of decision is made, and something that actually moves us forward. The big movement lately has been defunding the police. A lot of people hear that, and it's abolish the police and take all their money, and that's not it. What people are saying when they say defund the police is that we need to take a very, very good and a very detailed and thorough look at how we spend money for the police. Good example would be the protests in Greenville County, and how during that protest, the sheriff's office made use of at least one helicopter on 3 different occasions. They had attack dogs on the ready. They had tear gas. They had flashbangs. They had an armored vehicle. They had huge military grade weaponry. And the question on a lot of people's minds was, where did they get all that? How did they pay for it? And why do they have it? What need in Greenville County, South Carolina, does Sheriff Hobart Lewis possibly have to where he can actually rationalize that? And it's not just Greenville. I believe the LAPD, their budget for their police force is somewhere along the lines of $6 billion, which there was a Facebook meme going on. That's the amount of budget for the entire military for Ukraine. Why do they need that just strictly in LA County, especially when we have a lot of the reports from police brutality, corruption, you name it, it's all been in LAPD, and that's no secret. It's been that way since the dawn of time, since at least I can remember being born in 1992. So when we talk about defunding the police, we're talking about taking a look at that money, seeing what it is that they actually need, and taking the money that's used for these things that they don't really need. And I support taking a good look and assessing the salaries of police officers. Just like everybody else, if they're not making a living wage, they're more likely to have more added stress onto a job that already induces so much stress. You're going to have police officers that are going to snap and have mental issues. When you talk about defunding the police, taking that money into educating in the state of South Carolina, you have to spend more time training to be a beautician or a barber than you do for a police officer, which is absolute insanity when you really think about it. And not just investing in the education and training of our own officers, but if you take some of that money and you invest it in educating and training your community, putting it in after-school programs, putting it in post-secondary education opportunities, taking some of that money. I don't know how it is in York, but in Greenville County, um, we're talking almost upward to a $50 million budget for the Greenville County Sheriff's Office. Clemson, when I went there in 2010, operated on a $54 million endowment, which means that we could probably take maybe a half of the Greenville County Sheriff's Office and use that money to start a community college in Greenville County, a 4-year institution, and use that as a place where we can help train police officers and criminal justice professionals. Also taking a look at the fact that police are called for mental health disturbances, and they're not mental health professionals. They're called to deal with youth and delinquency. They're not teachers. They're not youth workers. They're not educators. They're not social workers. And a lot of those things, when police begin to get involved, you have a fear of retaliation from the communities that are dealing with them and those families that are dealing with police. You have a mistrust between police and a lot of the minority families, especially and poor working class families. Um, there's just a lot to look at. And I think now more than ever, we're starting to see that there are some discrepancies across the board that we really have to just assess ourselves, take a step back. How did we get here? When we talk about systemic racism, a lot of these institutions, um, I don't believe that anybody just becomes racist. I feel like you have to be raised in that environment. And South Carolina is the birthplace of the Confederacy, so our institutions just are just automatically, if it was put into place honestly before 1990 or 1980, in the South, you're probably dealing with some sort of institutionalized racism just off the cuff, just because of the environment that South Carolina has been and in some instances continues to be. So yeah, that's just, I guess that's kind of a start to it.
Yeah. I would say, yeah, you bringing up defund the police because, yes, that has been a very vocalized thing. And, I've heard people go, well, if you get rid of the police, what are you going to do? And, that's not what, defund the police is the equivalent of demilitarize the
Mhm.
police. It's just about taking a look at their funding and going, why are they spending money on, military grade equipment when, if there's ever a case where you need military grade equipment, that's what the National Guard's for.
Yeah.
The people who have trained with this equipment a little more than, our everyday officers.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I completely understand and I completely support taking a look at police funding and seeing how better we can put that money to use. And education is one of the best ways to use money.
Mhm.
I mean, not only does education help fight systemic racism, but it's going to help educate officers to deal better with, when they get called on mental, with people who are, struggling with mental health and, those kind of calls. It's going to help with them. But, you look at schools that are underfunded or poorly funded, and you're looking at a population that is more people of color than your predominantly white schools. And it's because you look back at it and, it starts with real estate, really. You know, it's all based on on income tax, on property tax. And when you look at the older generations of Black Americans, there was a lot of, they had a hard time either getting financing for housing or they just had to go into rentals, which, rentals aren't exactly always in the most high class areas. And it was all because of, redlining through banks and financial institutions. So, well, we're not going to lend to you. So, property owners are more likely to go to college. Well, if you can't get into property, you're most likely not going to go to college. And therefore, you're going to be behind your counterpart that was able to go to college when it comes to looking for a job and securing a job that pays a livable wage.
Well, there's a few misconceptions.
Yeah.
Um, as far as the income inequality, I will say that people that go and learn a vocation or a trade, they tend to come out doing a lot better, sometimes
Yeah.
3 or 4 times better than those that attended a traditional 4-year program. A lot of it deals with socioeconomic status. Some of it because of inequalities that stem back from slavery to Jim Crow and sharecropping to the civil rights era, because of some of those things, it may seem like a lot of people that suffer from low socioeconomic status, food insecurity, are Black. But the fact of the matter is that that's part of systemic racism and white supremacy. You you have to understand that the white race is just a little bit easier at the absolute minimum. It's just a little bit easier than the Black race. Um, it's not just in terms of education, but when you have a gap in that kind of generational wealth of not just money and not just knowledge, but of resources. A
Yeah.
lot of white people in the South were able to own land and to pass those things down. That wasn't an advantage that Blacks had, um, especially within the South. Some Blacks were able to go up north and find opportunities, but you also had some racism up there.
Yeah.
Um, but a lot of it impacts white working class and lower class families too. Um, when you think about socioeconomic status, a 6-year-old entering first grade that comes from a low poverty home is possibly may go into first grade knowing 1 million less words than their better off counterparts, known as the million word gap. Um, so if you're starting with that kind of deficit, it's going to get harder and harder to catch up. When you are in places where people do not understand you, therefore they cannot teach you, and they don't fully understand or care to understand what your situation is at home, and you get that over the plane of 13 years, your outcomes are going to be a lot different than those of your better off counterparts, especially because of how we zone not just school districts, but how we zone our House of Representative districts, our Senate districts, things like that. Um, we've got a lot of work to do to change the system, and I'll tell you, a lot of people don't want to talk about it, but these types of system rooted within systemic racism, we're not just talking about institutions and the police and the government. It is also within parties. It is also very much within the Democratic Party, whose electorate is 66.7%
Hmm.
Black, and in 140 years history has seen one Black chair, one. And Chair Robertson, um, at the convention this past week, responding to some comments about about race, said that 66% of his executive board, 66% of his executive leadership are all Black.
Yeah.
But in all honesty, one of my challenges to him are 66% of your county chairs Black. We're 66% of your delegates Black. These are the places of power,
Yeah.
and these are where the decisions are really made throughout the party. These are the people that help elect leadership, which help chooses which resources are going to which candidates, and what our
Yeah.
platforms look like and things like that. So it's very important that in all systems we seek to make sure that we're not just trying to achieve diversity, but we're trying to achieve fundamental fairness.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people do get that confused with if we've got diversity, then we're good. But, diversity is only as good as if people who actually have a true seat at the table and have a true voice,
Mm-hmm.
that's where your diversity is really important. Because just saying, oh, well, our party makes up this, so we're good, that's just, it's not enough.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to have people who have actual seats at the table to represent your diversity.
And I'd also say the systemic racism and certain barriers. I separate myself from a lot of people of color in my community on the call for reparations. I don't agree with reparations. I think honestly, in some ways, it is too late for people to to be coming and trying to cash check. But what would be more important to me than a flat out check would be to remove some of the barriers that stand between people of color, people of low income, working class people, and fundamental fairness. Some of that is education. The way that you fix that is by offering a public option for that, finding
Yeah.
ways to give those that seek a 4-year degree that don't have the funding to do it the opportunities to be able to do so. Healthcare is a big thing. Making sure that everybody that is sick has the opportunity to get high quality healthcare, regardless of
Yeah.
their income, regardless of their resources. These are the things that can really make the difference. I would say make more of a difference than a flat check would. And if you
Yeah.
can allow us to educate ourselves and allow us to take care of ourselves, then people will see that not only do Blacks want to do for themselves, but that they can really contribute to society if really given a fair shake. And right now, that isn't happening because we can't so much as walk to our apartments, walk in the park, go for a run without the threat of being shot down.
Yes.
And in some
Um,
cases by people that have sworn to protect and serve us.
yeah. I had a professor at Winthrop who gave the example of, imagine there's a race and, well, the start goes off and everyone takes off, but, you know, Black Americans are shackled. So, and then halfway through the race, the shackles are taken off. So, it's a good representation because it does show that, yeah, where slavery is ended, Jim Crow's gone, but that was all. But the Jim Crow era was 50 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not truly gone. It's just not officially on the books anymore.
I mean, it's hard to say that. There's still some Jim Crow era
Yeah,
laws actually on our books in the South Carolina Constitution and statutes, as well as many states throughout the South. Um, I I don't think that these things are harshly enforced, but you want to talk about systemic racism.
yeah,
Um, there's 3 drugs in the history of the United States when I believe when Richard Nixon was in office, um, they started the prohibition on illicit drugs, and the way that they set it up was the drugs had to go through a study. After they went through a study, they we if they were determined to be bad, they would be put on a schedule um, regarding what the punishment would be for possession and self distribution. But see, the way that it is now is that someone can come up and create a designer drug. Everybody can get high off of it. Nobody, and a bunch of people can die. Nobody can really do anything until a federal study is done and it's declared illegal. There's 3 drugs in the history of the United States where that have been banned that have never gotten studied: marijuana, cocaine, and heroin. Those things are rooted in systemic racism, because these were drugs that were known that you can lock up young men of color, especially at young ages, for sentences anywhere from 15 to 25 years. The A young man comes into his full potential around the age of 34. So if I can get you while you're 17 and shackle you for at least the next 15 years, by the time 34 comes around, you won't be worth anything. You won't really be able to contribute to society, which I believe is why 1/3 of all African American men somehow see the prison system. 13%, blacks are 13% of the population, but we're convicted of 50% of the crime. Come on. When you look at marijuana, it was something that was known you could arrest young Mexican men for. Cocaine was something you could arrest young black men for. Heroin and opioids was something that you could arrest young Asian men for very, very easily. Your 3 core minorities in the United States at that time. It was all about keeping them down and keeping them out of the race altogether. And it has seemed to work. When you look at the family units of these races, especially the black family unit, where so many of our men spend so much time in jail, you can see the destruction and the toll that this type of systemic racism takes on a person. The people that are more likely to see 13, 15, 17-year sentences are black people, are Latino people, are white people for the same thing. They typically have the resources for PTI or for a good lawyer to get the charges dropped, or maybe even some people have connections with the solicitor's office or the judge themselves, and are able to get away with certain things. Black people, people of color in general, don't have these things.
Yeah. And I mean, marijuana is a good point because we're seeing it become more legal in states across the
Mm-hmm.
country, while yet, people are still serving years for small time possession.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got, dispensaries that were marked as essential businesses during a pandemic.
Mm. I mean, I'm not gonna knock anybody's hustle, but at the same time, I mean, look who's profiting off of that. It
Yeah.
is mainly um, a white-owned and white-ran industry, when not only uh, are blacks incarcerated longer and more often, um, but black men have sacrificed their lives and their livelihood to transport those drugs illegally.
Yeah.
Uh, Latinos have done the same. Um, and they're not the ones profiting off of its legitimacy. They and there's a lot of states that have legalized that have not expunged records. So men sit in jail for something that is now perfectly.
Legal. Yeah. And if I've got nothing wrong with legalizing it, but that's a wrong that's got to be corrected if you're going to legalize marijuana.
Definitely.
Okay. Well, if you're good, we can call that a day.
All right.
Again, thank you for coming on. It was a pleasure, and
For
you
having me.
know, hopefully it can be very educational for people out there, especially during the times we're in. So
I hope so.